Start, sir. Welcome to the part 2 of psychoanalysis, the big if. So far in our first discussion, we have explored how different structures have been emerging throughout the history of human life and even before that. Also, at the same time, we discussed where the psychoanalysis lies in the structure. Now, what is the big if for psychoanalysis? Is there a challenge to the framework of psychoanalysis? Every structure had its own limitation driven with the timeline. Structures have been reconstructed, reformed, new discoveries, new concepts, new philosophies have always backed up with something interesting and more profound.
Right.
What happens when it is applied to psychoanalysis, which is a modern world philosophy or a science? Over to you, sir. What do you think? What is the challenge to the framework of psychoanalysis?
There are two directions from which the challenge is coming. One is within psychoanalysis, the big ifs were slowly getting manufactured in small components, and now these components are coming together to create a big if. So there are movements within psychoanalysis for the last 50-75 years, which is one direction from where the necessity to engage with the big if is coming. And the second direction is the closure of modernity, which is the framework in which psychoanalysis was born and developed. So both these are creating a challenge to the framework of psychoanalysis, and therefore the necessity to engage with the big if for psychoanalysis. Now let us look at what has been going on within psychoanalysis, which actually was not completely in synchronicity, in congruence with modernity and the framework of psychoanalysis in the classical sense of the word. Let us look at some of the rebels, some of the outliers, some of the developments which are not exactly fitting into the framework. They were like, it's almost like everyone had one stick that stuck out, but it was never at the center of psychoanalysis. The predominant part of psychoanalysis and the center of psychoanalysis always was in congruence with modernity. However, there were some sticks which were sticking out, and let us look at them. The first was Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. Jung's idea of transmission of certain experiences to the next generation. Now, this creates a fundamental problem for psychoanalysis, because if our unconscious is not strictly personal, then the model of the mind will be radically different, because we'll have to look at instinctual structures of our experience, which will be the archetypal structures. And then the whole science of psychology will be based in some way or the other with some innate structures. So this is a very fundamentally challenging element in psychoanalysis, the Jung's concept of the collective unconscious and the transmission of experiences in terms of some essence of those experiences. So there is something then called the heritage of mankind. And then we say the unconscious, some part of our unconscious is a 2 million year old self, because it's not strictly personal. Then it's a 2 million year old self which is working in us. And that creates a completely different canvas of the human mind. Because then,
and which makes sense.
Yeah, and yeah, that's the more difficult part of it, right? Because we are in a situation like quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, they say the most difficult thing about quantum mechanics is this, that it works. that because it works, it forces us to think in ways which we don't want to think in those ways. Right? It presents to us a weird picture of the reality.
Hmm.
Right? Something that is completely counterintuitive, completely counter to our everyday experience, and we don't even want to think that way. It makes us go crazy. But the difficult part is we cannot not do it because it works. So in most cases, the problem is something does not work. In quantum mechanics, the problem is it works. Because
Even in psychoanalysis, it works.
yeah, because that disturbs everything else in the world of knowledge.
Other structures are questioned then.
Correct.
The other ifs for.
So one is the ideas of Jung in terms of collective unconscious, in terms of transmission of experiences or essences of experiences genetically to the next generation. And the third being there being some sort of a organic unity. And occasionally Jung talked about part of the unconscious not being inside of man, being out there, which is even more esoteric and mysterious. Second is the work of Wilhelm Reich, who talked about the healing energy called orgon, and who constructed
Called
orgon, ORGON.
orgon.
Right. So he started first with Rolfing. So he said the character defenses and the repressions are systed in the body. And if you do the right kind of massages, they are released. So he started from there, went on to sexual experiments of actual experience, and went on to orgon. And this, while it was not accepted scientifically that it's actually making a difference to patients, but the ideas were sticking out of the psychoanalytic framework. They were not congruent to the psychoanalytic framework. And some of the ideas were good in the sense they need more investigation. Some of them may turn out to be true. Third is the work of Stanislav Grof, because Stanislav Grof has done extensive work on use of psychedelic substances. And he has done extensive research on how it is used in the shamanic rites and how this gives us access to those parts of mind very easily, which is otherwise difficult to get access to, and also to heal the mind in a very fundamental way in those rare states. And he calls them the holotropic states. So his work with psychedelics and in inducing special rare states called the holotropic states brings up a completely new area into psychoanalysis. Because in some of the work, his lectures he talks about, in the book also he writes, that after holotropic work, you actually encounter the archetypal world that Jung used to describe. And that creates a completely different canvas for psychoanalysis. Some people like Terence McKenna have commented very well that psychedelics may prove to psychoanalysis what telescope was to astronomy. Right? That in the inner world, it's like a telescope of the inner world, that it enables us to see what we cannot see with our naked eyes. So what we cannot see by direct internal reflection, internal exploration, without psychedelics, maybe psychedelics enable us to see those things, experience those things, and heal those things. So psychedelics is a completely different area. And in ISTDP, people are experimenting with psychedelics to overcome resistance to the flow of feelings. That imagine a situation, we find something psychedelic and you give it to the person and then go in for an ISTDP session, and the repressed anger, sadness, and guilt just flows out easily. How quick that would be. So this is one area. Beyond worked about what he called in the final years, the healing by O, the ineffable O, which is to go into a rare state where some sort of active containment is happening. And the healing, a very deep-seated healing happens in the person without any active intervention, interpretation, or anything. It's a silent mode of healing. And this is a complete contrast to psychoanalysis, which is based upon interventions. So this also is one element. Then we have work in transgenerational trauma. There they have found that in certain mice, trauma from one generation can be passed over to the other. That creates a very different idea of the human mind, a very different idea of pathogenesis and healing. Then we have the holistic framework building up. People using yoga, meditation, herbal concoctions, energy healing. And this, all of this creates a sort of a postmodern framework in a proto sense. That all of this is leading to a situation where small elements are building up, right, have come together, are existing, and once you put them together, a framework which can challenge the existing framework of psychoanalysis and put a big if to it, that situation is getting created. The situation is almost there. I think in 5-7 years time, the situation will mature and ripen, and then we'll have no choice but to deal with this big if and the new emerging framework. And this, in my view, will be a holistic, open, structuralism oriented framework. So there is a challenge. There is an inevitability of having to face the challenge. And in my opinion, an inevitability of the framework of psychoanalysis undergoing a complete change in next 7 to 10 years.
So instead of these segregated versions of the structures which are pre-created, when we think of a healthier structure which makes sense to each and individual structure which already is emerging or existed ever, sounds very holistic in nature. What would be the defining characteristic of such a framework? What all it would integrate into?
So when the big if comes on psychoanalysis, and the big if presents a radically new picture which cannot be accommodated within the existing framework of psychoanalysis, there will be no choice but to develop a new framework for psychoanalysis, right? A new paradigm for psychoanalysis. And specifics will emerge as we go into it with clinical experience, research, and thinking. But in a generic sense, we know what that framework is going to be. And the generic characteristics of that new framework, which inevitably will succeed the present framework of psychoanalysis, in my opinion, between 7 to 15 years, is the characteristics of that new framework are like this. One, there has to be some integration of schools of psychoanalysis. There will be some integration of East and West. And in the East, it's primarily going to be Hindu psychology, Hindu spirituality. Integration of epistemology into psychoanalysis. Integration of findings in the area of parapsychology, which I forgot to mention when I was talking about the challenges. In parapsychology, they do research on things like precognition. Can you know something before it happens? Or retrocognition. Can you find out something which has happened in the past but nobody knows about it? Like, for example, let us say a ship sunk in the Atlantic Ocean 200 years back. We have that data. We know the broad area where it sunk, it drowned, but we don't know exactly where it is. So somebody who claims to have abilities of retrocognition is videographed. He tells you exactly where to look for that ship, and then you send scuba divers to that area, and many times you actually find that ship. And this finding is more than 50%. So up to 50% you can say it's chance. But more than 50% cannot be chance. So if this is true in parapsychology, let us say, or even if it's contextually true with some conditions, it changes the complete idea of how our mind operates. The model of the mind undergoes a change. Model of reality undergoes a change. And therefore, pathogenesis and healing methods also will undergo a change. So, integration of something from parapsychology, integration of spirituality, and integration of holistic basket of tools, because psychoanalysis always has been a tool deficient and a tool resisting discipline. So integration of holistic basket of tools, and ultimately it will lead to a holistic healing framework where you will have a personality, pathology, intensity, and pathy, the healing technique, that kind of a framework or a kind of a manual which will emerge, which is the work of the next 25 years of holistic healing. So these are some of the generic characteristics that will be true, maybe more but not less, of the new framework of psychoanalysis.
So moving from the technicality to the larger landscape issues, can we look at some big if eventualities?
Right. So let us look at, there can be many big ifs psychoanalysis has to face now in the coming 5 to 15 years, most probably 7 to 15 years. Let me just give 5 examples of how it changes our ideas of model of the mind, pathogenesis, and healing. Let's take the first big if. Let us say the belief or isolationism of modernism, of modernity, is false. And we are not isolated, but we are a part of a organic unity. That all the systems in the universe and on this earth are actually interconnected to each other. And we are not isolated, but we are a part of the organic unity. Now what happens? If that is so, let us take two instances. Instance one, if there is an organic unity and if the human history and human individual life is a part of a larger purpose, and if one of the larger purposes of the existence is to process certain amount of affect in this cycle of the universe through the human race, then what would happen is you undertake a catharsis, and from universal nature, more of that affect comes into you. And this keeps happening, right? Keeps happening till by some law or by some grace or by some decision, existence decides, okay, his work is done, no more affect to be put into him of a particular type. Let's say we are dealing with anger, you keep doing catharsis and it keeps coming from outside. Now, mother who was working with Sri Aurobindo used to talk about it, that there are two ways of doing sadhana. One is to cut yourself off from collectivity and just process your stuff, or to join into the existence, and lot of stuff of others also will come in, or directly from universe will come in, from what Sri Aurobindo used to call waves from the Prakriti. Right? That they keep coming in, you keep cleaning yourself and these things keep coming in from outside. Now that creates a very different picture of how to do catharsis and what it can achieve. And what is not allowing healing, even though catharsis is happening session after session. Second, let us say there's something called the Akashic records, where anger generated not only in this birth, but previous birth is kept up. And the moment you cathart out anger of this birth, something from the Akashic record comes in. And not everything comes in, because something is still left for the next incarnation. But then we have to look at the science of that thing, how that thing is operating. That's a very completely different idea of reality, and that in turn affecting psychoanalysis. Third, next take the idea of reincarnation. which will fundamentally shake psychoanalysis if it comes true. That many of the pathologies will be traced not to childhood experiences but to predispositions created by the past birth. And there's no school of psychoanalysis which address this. So every school will have to undergo a change if that comes true, to accommodate those things. Every school will undergo a change. So if the first big if of organic unity is established, all schools will undergo a change. Reincarnation is established, all schools undergo a change. Psychedelics is established, all schools undergo a change. Because every school will have to factor in using psychedelics for healing. The Kleinians will have to think about how to use psychedelics for closing the split. The Freudians will have to think about how to use psychedelics for overcoming the Oedipus difficulties. And ISTDP will have to think about how to use it for releasing anger, sadness, and guilt and restructuring. Similarly, take the Hindu view of human being and the universe, that the universe is made of 7 zones. The material plane, the material zone, the life energy zone, the emotional zone, the thought zone, the karmic zone, the bliss zone, and the pure consciousness zone. And a man is an accumulation of all these things borrowed in small amounts from those respective zones. Just as we borrow 75 kg of material to create our body from the material of earth. Similarly, we borrow everything from the life energy zone, emotional zone, thought zone, all those zones. So if this world view and the view of construction of the individual comes true, right, the whole of psychology, psychotherapy, everything undergoes a change. And because of research in energy healing, more and more we are inclined to believe that something of this sort might be true. Coming to the holistic healing tools, how they are working, that many of them are working without using any principle of psychoanalysis. So when they are brought in as effective tools, there is no way but to fundamentally change the way we do psychoanalysis. So these are 5 examples. We can have a long list of examples, but any of this coming true poses a big if and forces psychoanalysis to fundamentally alter itself at the very foundations. So these are like paradigm changing big ifs. So these are some 5 specific examples, and we can have more of them. There is a long list.
So personally, do you believe in some of the 5 big ifs coming true? And how does that bear upon your theory and development and practice?
I have a iconoclastic and, in one sense, a very believer's belief. I believe not only all these 5 will come true, in addition to it, many things that we have not discussed also will come true, which are of the same color and flavor.
Okay.
So there is going to be a heavy rainfall of the big ifs. And I don't think the structure of psychoanalysis will survive that rainfall as it is. In all probability, we will see erosion, complete erosion of the structure and a complete rebuilding of the structure. And the core truths will survive. The core truths which are not dependent on the framework, they will definitely survive. And I feel that the holistic framework will have a very strong component of psychoanalysis. In many ways, it will be anchored, if not completely, at many points, it will be anchored in psychoanalysis. But the big ifs will change fundamentally the not only these 5 will come true, many other things will come true, and they will change fundamentally the nature of psychoanalysis. And therefore, one of the things that I have done is to create a model of the mind and a healing system, a system of therapy called HEAT, Holistic Elemental Analysis and Therapy. And that takes into account these big ifs and the generic nature of any new framework that has to emerge. So within that system, we have integration of schools, integration of East and West, integration of this view of reality of different zones, and integration of schools of psychoanalysis. And in that larger system, which can provide a new framework for psychotherapy, we can start with first anchoring everything in psychoanalysis and Hindu spirituality, and then bring in non-psychoanalytic components and non-Hindu spirituality components into understanding and healing of the mind. So I feel the big ifs not only are going to rain upon psychoanalysis, they are going to be proven true, and it will fundamentally alter the edifice of psychoanalysis and also the edifice of psychotherapy and psychology as a whole.
Intellectually rigorous and deeply enriching it was for me. Hope you liked the discussion, dear viewers. See you all again. Namaste.
Namaste.